SPQR, four harmless letters or the original blueprint for global manipulation. But what if hidden within the entire history of the Roman Empire was a much darker truth? You've seen them etched in stone, stamped on ancient coins, glamorized in every sword and sandal movie from Hollywood. But what if I told you it was never about the people, not for a single day? SPQR was a lie crafted by Rome's ruling class not to unite the Republic, but to control it. A weapon disguised as a promise, a symbol that turned conquest into duty and dictatorship into democracy. Because behind the marble temples and marching legions wasn't a republic rising, it was an empire rehearsing. And SPQR, it was the costume. Welcome to Shadows of Ancient History, where we don't just tell you what happened, we show you the lie that built an empire and how that lie never really died. The Roman Republic was born not from unity, but fracture. After driving out Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome in 509 BCE, the fledgling republic had to stitch together a society still haunted by monarchy. The patricians, Rome's aristocratic elite, seized control of governance through the Senate. But they faced a challenge: how to keep the masses, the plebeians, obedient without overt tyranny. Their answer was genius in its simplicity: Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. SPQR. It wasn't just a title, it was an incantation. A slogan of shared power, even if the actual power stayed firmly in the Senate's marble hands. By placing the people alongside the Senate, the elite offered an illusion of equality. But in the streets of Rome, illusions held real weight. While consuls were elected, candidates came almost exclusively from patrician lineages. While laws were debated, most were shaped behind closed doors by those who traced their family lines to the city's founding myths. Yet every decree, every proclamation, every military standard bore the mark of SPQR, as if the plebeians themselves had signed off on every act of the Republic. This clever masking extended into crises. During the early conflict of the orders, when plebeians demanded greater political rights, the Senate pushed back. It took years of strikes, protests, and secessions, literal walkouts of Rome's working class before the 12 Tables codified Roman law. Even then, many rules simply reinforced existing hierarchies. Historians still debate whether the 12 Tables were a true compromise or a calculated concession, notes one scholar. What's clear is that SPQR became the banner under which these negotiations were staged, regardless of who actually benefited. And yet the people believed. Belief was necessary. Rome was growing fast. Its infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, and city walls required both labor and loyalty. Convincing plebeians they were part of a grand sacred order meant fewer revolts and more willing participation. SPQR wasn't about describing the Republic, it was about prescribing it, telling citizens what Rome was supposed to be, not what it was. Even stranger were the symbolic rituals tied to SPQR. During major festivals like Ludi Romani Games were held not just in honor of the gods, but of the people. Chariots thundered down the Circus Maximus while banners bearing SPQR waved above. Senators watched from gilded seats. Plebeians sat on stone steps, all under the same letters, though not under the same rule. In the 4th century BCE, a curious event occurred. A Roman army trapped by the Samnites was forced to pass under a symbolic yoke in humiliation. The Senate rejected the peace treaty signed by the surviving consuls, declaring it invalid on behalf of SPQR. The people hadn't voted on the matter, but their name was invoked to reverse their representatives' decision. It was the earliest sign that SPQR wasn't a mirror of the people's will. It was a mask that could speak for them without their voice. By the time of the Latin War 340-338 BCE, SPQR was fully weaponized in rhetoric. The Latin League, a confederation of allied cities, sought equality with Rome. Rome refused, framing the conflict as rebellion. SPQR banners accompanied troops not to defend the homeland, but to discipline former friends. And so it began, not with conquest, not with empire, but with the illusion that when Rome marched, it did so as one with Senate and people united, even if one ruled and the other followed. The Samnites fell. The Etruscans weakened. Carthage loomed. Rome was no longer a city defending its borders, it was a state on the move. And every time it moved, SPQR marched first. What began as a symbol of domestic unity now unfurled across foreign soil, painted on war banners, carved into campaign milestones, whispered through Senate proclamations that claimed Rome never invaded it, liberated, never conquered, only protected. This framing appears repeatedly in Roman senatorial decrees, such as in Livy's accounts of early wars, and in justification, speeches preserved in Polybius's histories. By the 3rd century BCE, the logic of expansion had hardened into ritual. When war was declared, a Roman priest, the official, would perform an elaborate ceremony near the enemy's land. A spear was thrown, words were spoken, and when Rome won, the record would read, "Done in the name of SPQR." One of the clearest examples was the Punic Wars. Rome's series of brutal conflicts with Carthage stretched over a century, resulting in the complete annihilation of its greatest rival. The Senate painted these wars as preemptive, even necessary. Carthage, they said, threatened Roman grain routes, Roman allies, Roman values. But beneath that justification were deeper motives: control of Mediterranean trade, access to silver mines, and territorial dominance. And yet every fleet launched, every legion deployed carried SPQR. The phrase smoothed over complexity. It turned war into duty. Soldiers weren't fighting for gold or glory, they were serving the people. That's what the banners told them. Even stranger was the way SPQR was used after battles were over. When Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at Zama in 202 BCE, his triumphal procession in Rome featured elephants, captives, and exotic animals. But the real centerpiece was SPQR emblazoned on arches engraved into shields. It was a theater of virtue where military violence was paraded as public service. One might expect the Roman populace to grow weary of endless war, but they didn't. They were fed a narrative. Grain from Sicily, silver from Spain, gladiators from Gaul. Each war added spectacle, wealth, or security, and every Senate decree reminded them that it was all done under the authority of SPQR. Not one man, not one faction, the people. Historians still debate whether the Roman populace truly supported expansion, writes one researcher. But support was manufactured through symbols, spoils, and spectacle. And SPQR was the symbol that tied it all together. Consider the strange case of the Lusitanian Wars. Rome's campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula were long and brutal. One general, Servius Galba, tricked a group of Lusitanian tribes into surrendering, then slaughtered them. His actions were condemned in some circles, but his career wasn't destroyed. The Senate debated his punishment, but no official sentence was handed down. Why? Because Galba claimed to have acted in the interest of SPQR to prevent further rebellion, to protect Roman settlers. His defense wasn't legal. It was symbolic. He spoke the right words. And in Rome, that was often enough. Even among enemies, SPQR had weight. It became synonymous with Roman legitimacy. Some cities surrendered preemptively, asking to be accepted under the protection of SPQR. The phrase conferred not just power, but destiny. SPQR even crept into diplomacy. Treaties were signed not by consuls alone, but on behalf of the Senate and people. Foreign kings, like those in Numidia or Armenia, were granted titles and favors in friendship with SPQR. The phrase carried divine weight. To oppose it was to oppose the will of the Roman world, and that world was expanding fast. By 146 BCE, Rome had destroyed Carthage and Corinth. Two of the Mediterranean's brightest lights snuffed out in the same year. Rome's control now stretched across 3 continents. Yet the Senate still claimed it did not seek empire. It only answered the call of duty, the call of allies, the call of SPQR. But by now, something had shifted. Rome was not fighting to protect. It was fighting to prevent anyone else from becoming strong. And the people who once believed they were defending a republic were slowly becoming citizens of something else entirely. An engine, a machine, a state fueled by constant motion and justified by 4 sacred letters. SPQR was no longer a promise. It was a license to act, to conquer, to never stop. Rome stood tall but trembled within. After centuries of conquest, the real battles moved closer to home. Not against Gauls or Greeks, but against itself. The Republic, once proud of its checks and balances, fractured under ambition. Generals became politicians. Politicians became warlords. And all of them, without exception, claimed to fight for the people. They claimed SPQR. It began with Sulla. In 88 BCE, Lucius Cornelius Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched on Rome with his own legions. No foreign threat loomed, no invasion required. His target was domestic rivalries in the Senate, personal slights, a struggle over command in the East. But Sulla didn't frame it as a power grab. He claimed he was defending the Republic from corruption. And so his legions carved a bloody path through the city under the banner of SPQR. Once in control, Sulla unleashed a terrifying innovation: the proscription list. Citizens, often wealthy, often enemies, were labeled enemies of the state. Their names were posted publicly. Anyone could kill them for reward. Their property forfeit. Their deaths justified because they had betrayed SPQR. Rome bled, but the Senate stood behind him. Technically, everything was legal, official, endorsed in the name of the Republic. Sulla called himself dictator, but only to restore order. Historians still debate whether Sulla's dictatorship was intended as a temporary fix or the blueprint for future tyranny. What's undeniable is the precedent he set: if you claim SPQR, you can seize anything. Years later, Julius Caesar followed the same road. He too marched on Rome, this time in 49 BCE, crossing the Rubicon and igniting civil war. Like Sulla, he justified his rebellion as a defense of the people. He said the Senate had been corrupted, that liberty was in danger, that SPQR needed a savior. And again, the people believed. Or perhaps they were simply tired of the Senate's dysfunction. Caesar brought stability, spectacle, bread, games. His name was chanted in the forum, but still every edict bore the letters SPQR. Caesar did not kill the Republic in broad daylight. He smothered it behind a curtain made of familiar words. Even stranger was how the opposition mirrored him. Pompey, the Senate's champion, also claimed to fight for SPQR. His ships, his troops, his letters, all branded with the same four-letter promise. Two armies marched toward each other, each believing they defended the same republic. Only one would survive. The assassination of Caesar in 44 BCE was meant to restore the republic. Instead, it shattered it. Rome plunged into chaos. More civil wars, more generals, more blood. And SPQR remained passed from faction to faction like a sacred relic. When Octavian rose to power, Caesar's adopted heir, he understood what his predecessors had failed to grasp. You don't need to destroy SPQR. You need to own it. He portrayed himself as the princeps, the first citizen, a servant of the Senate and people. He rejected titles like king or dictator, even as he amassed total control. The Senate still met, the people still voted, but only on matters already decided behind closed doors. And all the while, SPQR remained etched in stone, pressed into coins, shouted from parade arches. Not as a memory, as a performance. A strange ritual unfolded under Augustus, the restoration of the Republic. He claimed to hand power back to the Senate. In truth, nothing changed. But the ceremony gave the illusion of balance. It was political theater of the highest order. The Republic hadn't been restored, it had been rebranded. The Senate and people still ruled in name only. The wars didn't stop. Augustus expanded into Egypt, the Alps, Germania. Each campaign was framed not as conquest, but as preemption, as defense, as Rome doing its duty as always in the name of SPQR. Even distant provinces adopted the symbol. Cities in Gaul, Asia Minor, and North Africa erected their own SPQR-inscribed monuments, not by command but by imitation. The symbol had become a magic talisman, a guarantee of protection, a stamp of legitimacy. But behind the chiseled stone, the Senate no longer held real power, and the people, they had been absorbed, appeased, replaced. SPQR survived, but it no longer described a republic. It described an empire pretending to be one. By the time the first century ended, Rome was no longer debating whether the Republic existed, it was reenacting it. The emperors who followed Augustus kept up the illusion. Tiberius Caligula, Claudius Nero, all different in temperament, yet all fluent in the same script. Their power was absolute, yet every decree, every coin, every monument still bore the words Senatus Populusque Romanus. Because to abandon SPQR would have been to admit the truth, that the people no longer ruled, that the Senate no longer decided, that the Republic was a ghost kept alive by marble ritual and repetition. And repetition was everywhere. Even the most autocratic rulers understood the importance of performance. Nero, while executing rivals and bankrupting the treasury, still held lavish games for the people. Arches were erected in the name of SPQR, even as senators died mysteriously in prison cells. Nero even had SPQR emblazoned on the shields of his Praetorian Guard, a symbolic gesture meant to signal unity between ruler and ruled. But it was empty. The guards served the emperor. The Senate feared him, and the people, they watched, they cheered, they starved. It was during this period that one of the strangest rituals began to take shape, what scholars now call Imperial ventriloquism. Emperors would issue decisions or reforms and then have the Senate formally request them after the fact. The process was backwards, but it created the appearance that power still flowed upward from the people through the Senate. The emperor was not a tyrant. He was responding to the will of SPQR. This charade continued for generations. Emperors came and went, some benevolent, others brutal, but all cloaked themselves in the Republic's shadow. Even when emperors were declared by the army, not the Senate, the official record would say SPQR endorsed the decision. Even when revolts were crushed with fire and crucifixion, the reports would say they were quelled for the protection of the people in the Senate. One of the most revealing moments came during the reign of Vespasian. Rising to power after a brutal civil war, the year of the four emperors, he sought to restore order. But instead of erasing the Republic's trappings, he leaned into them. He rebuilt the Temple of Jupiter, sponsored public games, and restored the Senate's ceremonial role. His propaganda campaign was simple. Rome had not fallen into chaos. It had been saved by SPQR through him. Strangely, one of Vespasian's administrative reforms included the standardization of tax collection across the empire. In Egypt, graffiti began to appear bearing the phrase SPQR and taxes forever. Historians still debate whether this was satirical or sincere. Either way, it reveals something odd. The symbol had begun to detach from its meaning. SPQR no longer referred to real power, but to the branding of power. Meanwhile, the empire stretched from Britannia to Mesopotamia. Its soldiers, often non-Roman by birth, carried standards engraved with SPQR into territories that had never heard Latin spoken before. It wasn't about language anymore. It was about legitimacy, about projecting the idea that whatever Rome did, whether it built a road or burned a village, it did for the people. SPQR had become an armor of righteousness. Even when Rome's own citizens were exploited, taxed into poverty, or conscripted into unwinnable campaigns, the Senate and people were invoked as beneficiaries. Declaring war, SPQR. Raising grain prices, SPQR. Enforcing religious conformity, SPQR. And then in 212 CE, a curious law was passed. Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, granting Roman citizenship to nearly every free man in the empire. On paper, it was a revolutionary act of inclusion. In reality, many scholars argue it was a fiscal maneuver to widen the tax base. But here's the twist now. Everyone was the people, which meant SPQR now stood for everyone, and therefore for no one. The phrase still held ceremonial power, but it was stretched thin, hollowed out, like a statue with no center, beautiful, empty, and impossible to topple because there was nothing left to strike. As the 3rd century wore on, crisis after crisis struck Rome, emperors ruled for months before being assassinated. Armies declared their own generals as Caesars. Civil war became common. And still, each new usurper claimed legitimacy through SPQR. Coins were struck overnight, banners stitched in haste. The short-lived Emperor Didius Julianus, who bought the throne in an auction, issued SPQR coins within hours of his election. The same letters repeated like a mantra over a fractured empire. Historians still debate whether SPQR persisted out of reverence or convenience, writes one classicist. But perhaps it doesn't matter, because by this point, SPQR didn't need meaning. It only needed presence. And it had that everywhere, etched into bricks, scrawled onto receipts, raised over legions led by emperors the Senate had never met. The Republic was dead, but SPQR never was. The Western Roman Empire collapsed not with a bang, but a fading echo, a moment that marked the end of the entire history of the Roman Empire as a political entity, but not as a symbol. In 476 CE, Romulus Augustus, ironically named after both Rome's mythical founder and its first emperor, was deposed by the barbarian general Odoacer. The Senate still existed, at least on paper, but the illusion had finally worn through. The eternal city was no longer eternal. And yet, SPQR remained. Even after the empire fractured, even after emperors became memories and legions disbanded, the symbol endured. Not in power, but in architecture, in scrolls, in the minds of those who still believed Rome had stood for something greater. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern half that survived the fall, abandoned the Latin language, embraced Christianity, and called itself Basileia Romaean Empire of the Romans. But it never used SPQR. That symbol, rooted in republicanism and pagan ritual, was too bound to the ghost of the West. Instead, it was medieval Europe, ironically, that kept the letters alive. During the Middle Ages, SPQR re-emerged in civic documents across Italy. In the 12th century, a strange revival occurred. The Commune of Rome attempted to resurrect republican governance. Their banners read SPQR, not as historical tribute, but as a claim. The people of Rome, though under papal influence and foreign intervention, believed the spirit of the Republic could still be reclaimed. It was political theater born from ruins. Then came the Renaissance. Artists, architects, and philosophers would look back to Rome, not with mourning but admiration. SPQR adorned newly rebuilt streets. Sculptors chiseled it into fountains. The symbol no longer meant governance, it meant civilization itself. Clean lines, order, grandeur. A world imagined to be just and strong, even if it never truly was. But the most chilling resurrection of SPQR came in the 20th century. Mussolini rose to power in Italy, not just as a fascist, but as a self-styled Caesar. He wore Roman robes and parades, delivered speeches from ancient balconies, and dreamt of a new Roman Empire. And always, he invoked SPQR. The abbreviation was stamped on manhole covers, posters, military insignia. Italian school children were taught that Rome had never truly died, that they were the heirs to a legacy of discipline, unity, and conquest. Under SPQR, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, bombed civilians, allied with Nazi Germany, all under the pretense of restoring Rome's glory. Historians still debate whether Mussolini believed in the Republic's ideals or merely exploited its myth, one scholar observes. But either way, the symbol served its purpose, again. Even stranger, SPQR now began to appear outside of Italy entirely, in military academies, in Western political speeches, in architecture that borrowed the gravitas of columns, eagles, and Latin inscriptions. It wasn't the letters themselves, it was the logic behind them, the justification of might through legacy, the framing of invasion as civilization, the idea that to bring order, one must first break nations. In modern wars, the language echoes spreading democracy, protecting our values, liberating the oppressed. These phrases are not new, they are translations. And while SPQR may not be carved into today's tanks or drones, the philosophy behind it moves just as freely. A curious moment occurred during the Iraq War. A U.S. general giving a press conference compared his mission to bringing order like the Romans did. The comment sparked debate. Some praised it, others recoiled. But few questioned the underlying assumption that empire can be benevolent if wrapped in noble words. In Rome, that noble wrapping was SPQR. Today, the symbol survives in Rome's coat of arms printed on garbage trucks in government buildings. Tourists buy SPQR keychains. They take selfies with ancient ruins. They rarely ask what the letters meant, or still mean, because symbols once hollowed are safe. They can be sold, celebrated, worn like armor. But behind them lies a legacy of conquest dressed as virtue. SPQR didn't die, it evolved. It adapted, carrying with it the shadows, slogans, and ambitions of the entire history of the Roman Empire long after the marble crumbled. And in the quiet corridors of modern power, where decisions of war and peace are made behind glass walls and sealed doors, its logic endures. Tell them it's for the people. Tell them it's for peace. Tell them it's always been this way. Then act. The marble has cracked. The banners have faded. But the symbol still breathes. SPQR, what once stood for Senatus Populusque Romanus, has become more than an inscription. It is a whisper behind every flag waved in the name of liberty, a shadow beneath every speech that speaks of duty, a trace of empire in every policy sold as peace. It no longer matters whether the Senate ruled, whether the people voted, whether the Republic ever truly belonged to them, because SPQR was never about reality. It was about resonance. And that's what gives a symbol power, not its truth, but its usefulness. The Roman elite understood this. So did Mussolini. So do leaders today. Wrap your ambition in shared ideals. Say it's for all of us. Say the people asked for it. Then let the words do the work. Even now, SPQR sits on lampposts in modern Rome, quiet, golden, harmless. But look closer. Those letters were once written in the dust of conquered cities, sung by legions, stamped on the backs of tribute in blood, and cheered by those who never saw the battlefield. And always, always they claimed to serve the people. So the next time you see a war wrapped in noble words, a law passed in the name of the public good, a banner raised in defense of civilization, ask yourself who really holds the sword and who just holds the seal. Because SPQR never truly died. It lives in silence, it thrives in symbols, and its greatest triumph was convincing the world it stood for us all.